Hello and welcome back to Downtime Activities. Matthew here with another help action for you all. Help action being our series where we kind of take a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons concept or rule set and break it down and give some hopefully fairly usable advice on it. Today we're going to be going over making your own spells in 5th edition D&D. It's something that's very lightly brushed on in the DMG, but is very hard to quantify, and so this is going to be a video going over what the DMG says, but more so giving my personal advice on how to go about this as a player and a game master. So let's take a look at it. To start with, I'll break down the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for creating your own spells. These are, as I said before, very limited because this is a very complex task to quantify. It lays out a couple of general guidelines like don't make it too powerful, lesser effects over longer durations can balance out, and make the effect something that the class should have access to, so no healing spells for a wizard, etc. It goes on to give a damage/healing chart with a number of d10 based on the spell's level for creating your own spells that deal damage or heal. These dice can be adjusted according to what sort of die you want to be rolling, for example 2d4 instead of 1d10, so long as the average result is still similar. It also goes on to say that this table assumes that the character can save for half damage. If the spell does not do that and instead it's a kind of all or nothing spell, the damage should be increased by 25%. These are fine, baseline for building generic damaging spells, but overall I find pretty useless because we have other ways of making damaging spells our own or changing other ones. My big advice if you're trying to make a new spell that's dealing damage is to reskin a damaging spell that already exists in the game. This can just be a one-for-one swap if, for instance, you're wanting to play a pyromancer character but there's not a fire spell that does quite the same thing that this lightning spell you really like does. Or you can change a lot of other small aspects of it to make the spell more unique in its own. For instance, you could change the type of saving throw, the damage dice involved, so long as these things stay balanced. You could change the way the area of effect is, whether it's a cone or a line, etc. Or you could give additional effects, again, remaining fundamentally balanced while changing these things. Let's give a quick example. A spell that most D&D players know well is Burning Hands. A first level spell that's a 15-foot cone of 3d6 fire damage, and the people in it can make a dex save for half damage. If you were playing a ice wizard, perhaps, and wanted to have a version of this, but instead it's cold, you could do Freezing Hands and have it still be a 15-foot cone, but maybe it's 3d4 cold damage instead, but also reduces their movement speed by 10 feet if they fail. And maybe it's a con save instead of a dex save since it's a frost-based effect. Similarly, you could do something like Shocking Hands, that's a 30-foot line instead of a 15-foot cone, still dealing 3d6 damage and still a dex save, but just changing that area of effect, from a 15-foot cone to a 30-foot line. These three spells are fundamentally fairly balanced, just a little different and make a little more sense for the kind of element being used. You could also just, if you're wanting a spell that's similar, same damage type, but kind of just one slight piece of it changed, do something like, I'd call it Flaming Lance. That would be the same as Burning Hands, but adjust it from that 15-foot cone to a 30-foot line. Still 3d6, still dex save for half, but it fills a kind of different purpose and can be used in a somewhat different way. These principles can be applied to pretty much any damaging spell that you can think of, and you can build a version that does the desired damage type or implements a new desired effect. When adding additional effects that aren't just adjustments of an area of effect or the type of damage dice being rolled, it's very important that you're mindful of how powerful those effects are and you adjust the other aspects of that spell accordingly. Because while a slight reduction in movement speed, as in my Freezing Hands example, is a pretty minor effect that only takes a small bit of damage off, if it were to instead paralyze or some other more powerful effect, you would need to adjust back other aspects of that spell accordingly or up how high a level is required to cast it. All these things need to be kind of stayed in a constant balance and flow to make sure that the spell is still balanced and fair. This is my advice for damaging spells, specifically spells that just kind of are basic attack spells. If you're wanting something that's more unique or unusual, here's where I would actually build completely new spells. These should really only be for these unique, unusual effects. I think that a reskinning or a reflavoring of other spells is ideal for damaging effects. But if you're wanting something, typically a utility or not just a fire version of a first level frost spell or etc., you should probably put more thought into this and make it its own new thing. It should be unique, it should be different, and it should be really well thought out. And this is where things get really tricky. There are so many wildly different effects that you have in the game or could come up with to try and make happen in your game that quantifying it is pretty much impossible. That's why the DMG doesn't really even try. Here are some tips, though, that I think help in approaching this to make sure that a cool, unique, powerful, but balanced spell is made in the end. Tip number 1, be cautious of homemade cantrips. Cantrips are able to be cast practically an infinite number of times, and you need to really take that into account when a player or you as the DM are homebrewing a cantrip spell. If it's just a new cantrip spell that does a different type of damage or something along those lines, it should be fine, but if it's a unique effect, think if somebody could do this effect 10 times a minute and had hours and hours of downtime, could they completely blow the world or the story open? If the answer to that is yes, do not make that a cantrip. Next up, if it is a spell that is useful in combat, you should make sure that it is not a de facto, go-to, every round attack, because that probably means it's too strong. We're not looking to just make one perfect offensive spell that they can use with all their spell slots over and over again. It should be a spell that's different, or a different option, a different way of using a damaging effect that is useful in certain situations, but not just the go-to option. If it is, that's probably too strong of a spell. Something probably needs to be taken back there. The next bit of advice is kind of the go-to advice for almost everything when homebrewing or coming up with stuff, and that is make sure that there is a very clear conversation as the player and DM in how this spell works, exactly how the spell works, and make sure that that stuff is all laid out and decided and agreed upon before it's used in play. This will avoid confusion and will help determine the appropriate level and stuff so that the player gets to use their new cool spell and everything works well without a bunch of questions in play of like, oh, but what about in this situation? That stuff will come up anyways, but making sure you know exactly what the spell does before play will help limit or avoid these things. Another bit of advice is to be open to adjusting the effect or spell slot level required for a spell if need be after it is implemented into play. If a spell is far more or less powerful than you anticipated, adjust it. This may mean removing it altogether, hopefully not, but oftentimes it's just going to be making it a spell slot higher or lower to cast, or toning back or pushing one of the effects that it has to make it a little more fair in play and balanced. Ideally, you don't have to remove it altogether, and so there's a little less of that, like, why were you able to cast this spell one day and not the next day kind of suspension of disbelief stuff. But the important thing is to keep the game fun and balanced and moving along well, and if a spell is exploitative or just underpowered and never going to be used, then adjustments should be made, and you should feel free to do so even after they're implemented into play. Another bit of advice, if a character is creating a new spell during play, this can and oftentimes should take time and resources for that character to do. Make it a roleplay thing. Make it something in-world that this character is studying and practicing and discovering this brand new spell that no one else has cast before. Especially if it's a unique effect, not just a reskinning of another spell, this can be a cool roleplay opportunity that has a really rewarding moment in the end when they've created their new spell. This leads us to our next bit of advice, which is if a character comes up with their new spell, let them name it after themselves. If they put that time, effort, energy, and creativity into coming up with this new spell in character, and it was this cool roleplay moment, in the end, them getting to name this spell and name it after their character and make it kind of a real permanent spell in the world can be a really cool, gratifying moment. For example, it's not just Flaming Lance, it's Merlin's Flaming Lance, or Gandalf's Silent Portal. Both of which sound vaguely like euphemisms, but you get my point. Getting to name stuff after yourself is really cool, and it'll make their character kind of get ingrained into the magic of the world. And last bit of advice, as a player, don't just try to come up with something overpowered and find a way to force it into the game, or trick the DM into agreeing to it so that you have a spell that's more powerful than it should be. The point of creating a new spell is to give a new and unique option in play, not just make a more powerful version of what already exists. We, as DMs, really want to leave these kind of options open and allow creativity to flow and flourish and have our players come up with cool stuff and add that stuff into the world. But if you as a player are constantly trying to use a freedom like this and just use it to make your character more powerful than they should be compared to other characters or something along those lines, it's going to burn out your DM and they're probably going to remove it as an option altogether. Remember the point of this. You're making a new spell that either fills a niche that your character needs or adds a new option or interaction with the world that wasn't there before that will make for a better story, a cooler story, and fun options in play. That should be the focus, not power gaming, not making your wizard more powerful than another wizard the same level. That's not the point of this kind of stuff. Have fun with it, be creative, talk with your DM, talk with your players if you're the DM, and make sure that everything is agreed upon, set in stone, decisions are made, and these are well implemented into play. That has been our help action on creating your own spells in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give the video a like. Down in the comments below, please feel free to drop any spells you or a player or DM in your group has come up with. I'd love to see a bunch of different homebrew spells that maybe we could throw into our game. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.